Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1908 brought an unusual silence to the remote valleys of Webster County, West Virginia. It was the kind of silence that made even the hardiest mountain folk uneasy, a quiet that seemed to press against the ears like thick wool. In the hollows, where the Tug Fork River carved its ancient path through limestone and shale, something had disturbed the natural order of things. The local Cherokee had a word for places like this, Enviashi Duleni, where the earth itself holds secrets too dark for daylight. Among the scattered homesteads that clung to the mountainsides like barnacles to a ship's hull, one property stood apart from the rest, not because of its size or grandeur, but because of the peculiar way it seemed to exist outside the normal rhythms of Appalachian life. The Grimwald family compound, as it came to be known in the few official documents that mentioned it, occupied a natural basin approximately 8 miles southeast of Webster Springs, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of ancient hemlock and rhododendron. Corvus Grimwald had purchased the land in 1887 through a complex series of transactions that, according to county records, involved several middlemen and shell companies. The deed, filed at the Webster County Courthouse and later discovered during a routine archive reorganization in 1962, listed the property as comprising 347 acres of mixed woodland and natural meadow, suitable for agricultural and residential development. What it failed to mention was the property's previous history, or why it had remained unsold for nearly 2 decades before Grimwald's arrival. The family itself was something of an enigma to their scattered neighbors. Corvus, described in contemporary accounts as a man of medium height with prematurely gray hair and unusually pale eyes, claimed to be a scholar of what he termed traditional mountain practices. His wife, Minerva, was rarely seen by outsiders, though those few who encountered her described a woman of striking beauty marred by a nervous disposition that manifested in constant trembling of her hands and a habit of speaking only in whispers. Their adult offspring presented an even more puzzling picture. Cassius, the eldest at 31, possessed a university education, rare for the region, and reportedly spoke several languages fluently. His sister Cordelia, 28, was said to be well versed in botany and chemistry, though no formal records of her education existed. The youngest, Bartholomew, had studied medicine for 3 years at the University of Virginia, before abruptly withdrawing without explanation in 1906. What made the Grimwald family notable to historians studying the period was not their education or relative prosperity, but rather a series of increasingly disturbing reports that began to surface in the summer of 1908. These accounts, preserved in the private correspondence of Dr. Elias Fairchild, the county's only trained physician, paint a picture of a family whose pursuit of what they called ancestral knowledge had led them down paths that defied both medical science and social convention. Dr. Fairchild's first mention of the Grimwalds appears in a letter to his colleague, Dr. Samuel Morrison, in Charleston, dated July 15, 1908. In careful, measured prose, Fairchild describes being summoned to the family compound to treat what was described as a hereditary condition affecting multiple family members. What he found there challenged his understanding of both medicine and human nature. The family presented with symptoms I have never encountered in 15 years of practice, Fairchild wrote. All 4 family members exhibited a peculiar pallor that seemed to emanate from beneath the skin, giving their complexions an almost luminescent quality in low light. More disturbing was their unanimous claim that this condition was not pathological, but rather the result of what they termed guided evolution, a process they insisted had been practiced by their ancestors for generations. Fairchild's medical notes, discovered among his personal effects following his death in 1924, reveal that the Grimwalds had invited him not to cure their condition, but to document it. They spoke of their family as keepers of ancient knowledge, practitioners of techniques that could, in Corvus Grimwald's words, accelerate the natural processes by which humanity adapts to its environment. The physician's growing unease becomes evident in subsequent entries. The Grimwalds, he noted, seemed to view their bodies as laboratories for experimentation. They spoke casually of controlled exposures to various environmental factors and chemical compounds, processes they claimed had been refined over multiple generations. Most disturbing to Dr. Fairchild was their apparent practice of what they called selective breeding within the clan, a euphemism for breeding practices that went far beyond what was socially acceptable, even in isolated mountain communities. By August of 1908, Fairchild's correspondence reveals a man struggling with ethical and professional obligations. The Grimwalds had offered him substantial payment to serve as their family physician, but increasingly he found himself documenting practices that violated every tenet of medical ethics. In a letter dated August 23, 1908, he confides to Dr. Morrison, "They speak of their modifications as though they were scientific advancement, yet what I observe appears to be systematic degradation of human physiology. Their blood samples show unusual properties, increased viscosity, abnormal cellular structures, and most peculiarly, a resistance to coagulation that defies explanation." The family's isolation was both geographical and social. They maintained minimal contact with their neighbors, venturing into Webster Springs only for essential supplies and always in the company of at least 2 family members. Local shopkeepers noted their unusual purchasing habits. Large quantities of chemical supplies typically used in photography and metallurgy, substantial amounts of raw meat that they claimed was for their research animals, and medical texts that they ordered through special arrangements with suppliers in Baltimore and Philadelphia. Sarah Kellner, who operated the general store in Webster Springs from 1902 to 1915, left a detailed account of her interactions with the Grimwalds in her personal journal, discovered during the demolition of her home in 1963. Her observations provide insight into the family's increasingly strange behavior as 1908 progressed. "They moved like people who were always cold," Kellner wrote. "Even in the summer heat, they wore heavy clothes and spoke in the careful way of folks who weren't quite sure how their voices would sound. Minerva Grimwald never looked you straight in the eye, but when she thought you weren't watching, she'd stare so hard it made your skin crawl. The men were polite enough, but there was something about the way they talked. Too formal, like they were reciting lines from a play they'd memorized but didn't quite understand." More troubling were the family's requests for specific items. They required unusual quantities of preserving salts, embalming chemicals, and medical specimens that Kellner had to special order from suppliers in larger cities. When questioned about these purchases, Corvus Grimwald would explain that they were conducting genealogical research that required the preservation of various biological materials for study. The first indication that something was seriously amiss came in September 1908, when several neighboring families reported strange sounds emanating from the Grimwald property during the night hours. These were not the familiar sounds of mountain life, the calls of owls, the movement of deer through underbrush, or the settling of old wooden structures. Instead, witnesses described low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously, occasionally punctuated by what could only be described as metallic scraping sounds. Moses Hartley, whose family farmed a plot of land approximately 2 miles from the Grimwald compound, was among the first to document these disturbances. In a report filed with the county sheriff in October 1908, Hartley described being awakened repeatedly by sounds he characterized as singing, but not any kind of singing natural to these mountains. The sounds, he claimed, occurred primarily between the hours of midnight and dawn, always following the same pattern. A period of silence, followed by the low humming, then a gradual buildup of what he described as machinery sounds, though I know they have no machinery up there. The sheriff at the time, a man named Tobias Blackwell, was disinclined to investigate reports of unusual sounds coming from private property. His reluctance may have been influenced by the substantial property taxes the Grimwalds paid annually. Their payments to the county represented nearly 8% of Webster County's total revenue for 1908. However, when similar reports began arriving from families living as far as 5 miles from the Grimwald property, Blackwell found himself obligated to make at least a cursory investigation. His single visit to the family compound, documented in a brief report dated November 3, 1908, reveals little about what he observed, but suggests that the experience left him reluctant to return. "Family cooperative and courteous," Blackwell wrote. "No evidence of disturbing the peace observed during daylight hours. Complainants advise that sounds from private property during nighttime hours are not inherently criminal unless causing demonstrable public nuisance." What Blackwell did not include in his official report, but confided to his deputy, Jonathan Waits, was his impression of the Grimwald family itself. According to Waits's personal notes, discovered among his papers in 1967, Blackwell described the family members as changed somehow from normal people, and mentioned that their dwelling had been extensively modified with what appeared to be soundproofing materials and unusual ventilation systems. More disturbing was Blackwell's observation that the family seemed to be conducting some form of medical or scientific work in outbuildings scattered throughout their property. He reported seeing glass vessels, distillation equipment, and what appeared to be examination tables, though the family claimed these were simply tools for their historical research into traditional mountain medicine. The autumn of 1908 brought increasingly frequent reports of disturbances associated with the Grimwald property. Hunters reported finding animal remains arranged in patterns that served no apparent purpose, their organs removed with surgical precision. Several families noted that their livestock exhibited signs of stress when pastured in areas with sightlines to the Grimwald compound, refusing to graze and displaying behaviors typically associated with the presence of predators. By December, the situation had escalated to the point where neighboring families began organizing informal patrols, ostensibly to protect their property, but primarily to monitor the strange activities occurring at the Grimwald homestead. These patrols, led by local farmer Jeremiah Coswell, documented increasingly bizarre observations that challenged rational explanation. Coswell's journal, preserved in the Webster County Historical Society archives, describes nighttime activities that included the systematic burning of what appeared to be organic materials, resulting in smoke that produced a distinctly sweet, cloying odor that persisted for hours after the fires were extinguished. On several occasions, patrol members observed lights moving through the Grimwald property in patterns that suggested some form of ritualistic or ceremonial activity. Most disturbing was an incident that occurred on December 18, 1908, when patrol member David Tompkins claimed to have observed what appeared to be human figures moving through the family compound in ways that defied normal locomotion. According to Tompkins' written account, the figures moved with a peculiar gliding motion, as though their feet did not quite touch the ground, and they seemed to communicate without speaking, turning and moving in perfect synchronization despite being separated by considerable distances. The winter of 1908-1909 brought an intensification of the strange phenomena associated with the Grimwald family. As snow deepened and travel became more difficult, the family's isolation increased, but paradoxically, reports of disturbing incidents became more frequent. The sound disturbances evolved from rhythmic humming to what witnesses described as voices speaking in harmony, but not in any language we recognized. Dr. Fairchild's final entries regarding the Grimwalds, dated between January and March of 1909, reveal a physician increasingly concerned about the ethical implications of his professional relationship with the family. His observations suggest that the Grimwalds' research had progressed to experiments that involved fundamental alterations to human physiology. They have shown me documentation of their family's genealogical practices dating back 6 generations, Fairchild wrote on February 14, 1909. What they describe is not merely inbreeding, but systematic modification of genetic traits through controlled mating and what they term environmental conditioning. They claim to have produced family members with enhanced sensory capabilities, increased resistance to disease and toxins, and what they describe as expanded consciousness, the ability to perceive aspects of reality normally hidden from human awareness. Fairchild's medical examinations during this period documented physical changes in the family members that progressed beyond the unusual pallor he had initially observed. Their blood chemistry showed increasing deviation from normal human parameters. Their reflexes had become hyperacute to the point of being startling in their rapidity, and most disturbing, their pain responses had diminished to levels that allowed them to undergo medical procedures without anesthesia. More troubling was their psychological presentation. The family members spoke with increasing disconnection from normal human emotional responses, discussing their modifications and experiments with the detached interest of researchers. Observing laboratory subjects, they showed no apparent distress when describing procedures they had undergone or when discussing the fate of family members who had not successfully adapted to their enhancement processes. The implications of Fairchild's observations became clear in his final entry regarding the Grimwalds, dated March 26, 1909. I can no longer in good conscience continue to serve as physician to this family. What they have achieved represents not medical advancement, but a systematic abandonment of human nature itself. They are no longer, in any meaningful sense, the same species as their neighbors. The modifications they have achieved over generations of controlled breeding and chemical exposure have produced individuals who retain human appearance, but have fundamentally altered physiology and psychology. Spring brought new concerns as the Grimwald family's activities began to extend beyond the boundaries of their property. Local families reported the discovery of unusual installations, elaborate arrangements of stones and metal objects that appeared to serve some form of communication or monitoring purpose on land adjacent to but not owned by the Grimwalds. These installations, described in contemporary accounts as resembling astronomical instruments combined with telegraph equipment, were positioned to provide sightlines to various neighboring homesteads. When confronted about these encroachments, Corvus Grimwald claimed they were survey markers related to historical research he was conducting on behalf of an unnamed university. However, families who discovered these installations reported experiencing unusual phenomena in their vicinity. Electronic equipment malfunctioned, animals avoided the areas, and people working near them reported symptoms including dizziness, nausea, and what they described as hearing voices that weren't there. The situation reached a crisis point in May 1909 when the Hartley family reported that their teenage daughter Susanna had begun exhibiting behavior that bore disturbing similarities to descriptions of the Grimwald family members. She had developed an unusual pallor, spoke in the same formal, detached manner, and claimed to be receiving educational communications from sources she could not or would not identify. Medical examination by Dr. Fairchild revealed that Susanna Hartley's blood chemistry had begun to show the same anomalies he had observed in the Grimwalds. Most alarmingly, she reported having visited the Grimwald compound on several occasions, though her family insisted she had never left their property without supervision. This incident galvanized the local community into action. A meeting was organized by prominent citizens, including the sheriff, the county magistrate, and representatives of the major families in the area. The consensus reached at this meeting was that the Grimwalds represented a threat to public safety and needed to be removed from the community. However, the legal framework for addressing such a situation was unclear. The family had committed no obvious crimes, owned their property legally, and conducted their activities on private land. Sheriff Blackwell found himself in the position of needing to act against a family whose only apparent offense was being different in ways that defied explanation. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Morrison in Charleston, Dr. Fairchild's colleague, had been sharing information about the Grimwald case with physicians in other states. This informal network of medical professionals revealed that similar reports had surfaced in isolated communities across the southeastern United States over the previous 2 decades. A pattern emerged of families with unusual practices and physical modifications who would establish themselves in remote areas, conduct mysterious activities that disturbed local populations, and then disappear suddenly, leaving behind evidence of experiments that challenged understanding of human biology and psychology. In each case, the families claimed to be carrying on ancestral traditions related to human enhancement through controlled breeding and environmental conditioning. More disturbing was the discovery that these families appeared to be connected to each other through a network of correspondence and periodic gatherings. Intercepted letters found among the Grimwalds' possessions during a search conducted in June 1909 revealed communication with similar groups in the mountains of Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. The letters, written in a combination of English and symbols that resembled no known language, discussed the progress of various enhancement projects and made reference to what was termed the Great Work, an apparently long-term project aimed at producing modified humans capable of surviving environmental changes that would prove fatal to unmodified human populations. This discovery provided the legal justification needed to act against the Grimwalds. The letters were interpreted as evidence of a conspiracy to conduct illegal medical experiments and potentially to engage in activities that threatened public health. Search warrants were obtained and a force consisting of sheriff's deputies from 3 counties was assembled to investigate the Grimwald compound. The search, conducted on June 15, 1909, revealed the full extent of the family's activities. The main dwelling had been extensively modified with underground chambers that housed sophisticated laboratory equipment, including apparatus for chemical synthesis, biological preservation, and what appeared to be surgical facilities. The family's research materials included preserved biological specimens, human and animal tissues, organs, and complete organisms, arranged in systematic collections that suggested long-term study. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed records documenting 6 generations of controlled breeding within the extended family. These records, maintained with scientific precision, track the inheritance of specific traits and the effects of various chemical exposures on different family lineages. The goal, according to the family's own documentation, was to produce humans capable of surviving in environments that would be lethal to normal people. The records also revealed the fate of family members who had not successfully adapted to the enhancement processes. Their remains were preserved in the underground chambers along with detailed notes on the causes of their deaths and the modifications that had been attempted. The number of these preserved remains suggested that for every family member who successfully adapted, several others had died in the process. When confronted with this evidence, the Grimwald family showed no recognition that their activities might be considered criminal or immoral. They spoke of their work as a noble effort to prepare humanity for future challenges and expressed pride in their family's commitment to advancing human evolution through controlled experimentation. However, the legal system of 1909 had no framework for addressing such activities. The charges ultimately filed against the family included illegal disposal of human remains, conducting medical procedures without proper licensing, and violation of public health statutes. The evidence of human experimentation was so far outside normal criminal categories that prosecutors struggled to formulate appropriate charges. The trial, held in the fall of 1909, became a sensation that attracted attention from newspapers across the eastern United States. The Grimwald's defense, conducted by attorneys brought in from Washington, D.C., argued that their clients were engaged in legitimate scientific research and that their activities violated no laws that existed at the time they were conducted. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Marcus Kellerman, faced the challenge of proving criminal intent in activities that the defendants claimed were beneficial to humanity. The case was complicated by the fact that expert medical testimony was divided on whether the family's modifications represented advancement or degradation of human physiology. Dr. Fairchild's testimony proved crucial to the prosecution's case. His detailed documentation of the family's medical abnormalities and his professional opinion that their activities represented dangerous experimentation on human subjects provided the foundation for criminal charges. However, the defense presented their own expert witnesses, including several physicians from prestigious medical schools, who argued that the Grimwald's work represented innovative approaches to human health that were simply ahead of their time. These witnesses pointed out that many medical practices now considered routine, vaccination, surgical anesthesia, even basic hygiene, had once been viewed with suspicion by conservative medical establishments. The jury's verdict reflected the complexity of the case. The family members were found guilty of violations related to disposal of human remains and unlicensed medical practice, but were acquitted of the more serious charges related to human experimentation. The sentences imposed were relatively light, fines and short jail terms, but included a provision that would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. As a condition of their sentences, the Grimwald family was required to leave Webster County and was prohibited from establishing residence in any community in West Virginia. This precedent was quickly adopted by authorities in neighboring states, effectively creating a legal mechanism for preventing the family from settling in any established community throughout the southeastern United States. What followed was a systematic campaign of legal and social exclusion that expanded far beyond the original intent. As news of the Grimwald case spread, communities across the eastern United States passed ordinances specifically prohibiting the family from establishing residence within their boundaries. Law enforcement agencies shared information about the family's activities, creating a network of surveillance that tracked their movements. The Grimwalds found themselves in the unprecedented position of being legally excluded from virtually every established community in the United States. Their attempts to settle in remote areas were thwarted by local authorities who had been alerted to their presence by an informal but effective communication network among law enforcement agencies. By 1911, the family's situation had attracted international attention. European authorities, alerted by their American counterparts, began implementing similar exclusion policies. The Grimwalds' attempts to establish residence in Canada were blocked by immigration authorities who had been briefed on their activities. What had begun as a local law enforcement action had evolved into something unprecedented in modern history. A family that had been effectively banned from residing anywhere in the civilized world. They became nomads by legal necessity, constantly moving from place to place as authorities identified their presence and forced them to relocate. The family's response to this situation revealed the extent to which their modifications had changed their fundamental nature. Rather than showing distress or attempting to reform their behavior to gain social acceptance, they adapted to their nomadic existence with efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. They developed sophisticated methods for maintaining their laboratory work while constantly moving, created communication networks that allowed them to coordinate with other excluded groups, and continued their research despite the legal and social obstacles they faced. Reports of Grimwald sightings became a recurring feature in law enforcement communications throughout the 1910s and 1920s. The family was observed in remote areas of Canada, Mexico, and even South America. All was maintaining their secretive research activities, and all was eventually being identified and forced to move on by local authorities. The network of communication that tracked their movements revealed that the Grimwalds were not alone in their exile. Other families with similar practices and legal troubles had been identified and excluded from various communities, creating a population of nomadic experimenters who maintained contact with each other and continued their activities despite their legal isolation. This underground network of excluded families began to be referred to by law enforcement agencies as the banished, groups that had been collectively prohibited from establishing permanent residence anywhere in the civilized world due to their dangerous research practices and modifications of human physiology. Intelligence gathered by various law enforcement agencies suggested that the banished had established temporary settlements in extremely remote areas. Abandoned mining camps in the Canadian wilderness, uninhabited islands off the South American coast, and underground complexes in desert regions where no established government maintained effective control. The last confirmed sighting of the Grimwald family was reported by Canadian authorities in 1934, when they were observed establishing a temporary camp in the remote regions of the Northwest Territories. By this time, the original family members had been joined by individuals from other excluded groups, creating a community of modified humans whose activities remained mysterious, but continued to generate concern among law enforcement agencies. World War II disrupted the international cooperation that had maintained the exclusion of the banished families. The destruction of communication networks and the reorganization of law enforcement priorities created gaps in the surveillance system that had tracked their movements for more than 3 decades. When authorities attempted to reestablish contact with the banished after the war, they discovered that the excluded families had vanished entirely. The remote settlements that had been monitoring points for law enforcement agencies were found abandoned, with no trace of their former inhabitants except for sophisticated underground facilities that suggested the family's research had continued to advance during their years of exile. The fate of the Grimwald family and their associates among the banished remains unknown. Some investigators theorized that they had succeeded in establishing permanent settlements in regions too remote for effective government monitoring. Others suggested that their modifications had progressed to the point where they could survive in environments where normal humans could not, allowing them to inhabit areas previously thought uninhabitable. More disturbing was the possibility raised by some researchers that the banished had achieved their goal of producing modified humans capable of surviving catastrophic environmental changes. If this was the case, they might represent a form of humanity that had deliberately isolated itself from conventional human civilization in preparation for future global disasters. The legacy of the Grimwald case established legal and social precedents that continued to influence how authorities dealt with unusual communities and experimental groups. The concept of collective exclusion, banning entire families or groups from settling in established communities based on their practices rather than their criminal actions, became a tool used by governments to control populations that were considered threatening to social order. Contemporary scholars studying the case have noted that the Grimwald's claims about preparing humanity for environmental challenges proved prophetic in some respects. The 20th century brought global conflicts, environmental disasters, and technological changes that required human societies to adapt rapidly to survive. Whether the family's approach to accelerating human adaptation was innovative or simply dangerous remains a subject of debate. The scientific community's assessment of the Grimwald's work has evolved over time. Early medical professionals dismissed their activities as dangerous quackery, but modern geneticists and evolutionary biologists have noted that some of their techniques anticipated legitimate scientific developments by several decades. Their understanding of genetic inheritance and their systematic approach to modifying human traits preceded scientific breakthroughs in these fields by 50 years. However, the ethical framework within which they conducted their research remains controversial. Their willingness to experiment on family members, including procedures that frequently resulted in death, violated every principle of medical ethics. Their view of human beings as experimental subjects to be modified for future survival reflected a philosophical position that prioritized species adaptation over individual welfare. The question of whether the Grimwalds represented innovation or danger cannot be answered definitively because the full results of their work remain unknown. The modifications they achieved in themselves and their descendants demonstrated that their techniques were effective, but the long-term consequences of their alterations to human physiology were never documented. Some researchers have suggested that the Banished may have succeeded beyond their original goals, producing modified humans so different from baseline humanity that they effectively represent a new species. If this is the case, the exclusion of these families from human civilization may have resulted in the creation of a parallel evolutionary path that could eventually supersede normal humans. The investigation into the fate of the Banished continues in a limited form, primarily through the efforts of academic researchers studying the historical record, and occasionally through reports of unusual communities discovered in extremely remote areas. These investigations have been hampered by the decades that have passed since the last confirmed sightings, and by the sophisticated methods the excluded families developed for concealing their activities. The most recent evidence suggesting the continued existence of the Banished came from a 1967 archaeological expedition in the Yukon Territory, which discovered an abandoned facility containing equipment and documentation that appeared to be consistent with the type of research conducted by the excluded families. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site indicated that the facility had been occupied as recently as the early 1960s. The documentation found at this site, written in the same combination of English and unknown symbols that had characterized Grimwald family communications, described research projects that had advanced far beyond the relatively primitive experiments conducted in the early 1900s. The documents suggested that the Banished had developed techniques for modifying human genetics that would not be achieved by mainstream science until decades later. Most significantly, the documents contained references to successful modification programs that had produced individuals capable of surviving in extreme environments, underwater, in high radiation areas, and in atmospheric conditions that would be lethal to normal humans. If accurate, these references suggest that the excluded families achieved their goal of creating modified humans adapted for survival in post-disaster environments. The implications of this possibility continue to concern some researchers. If a population of genetically modified humans exists somewhere in the world's remote regions, their eventual reintegration with normal human civilization could present unprecedented challenges. The question of whether such individuals would consider themselves part of human society or would view normal humans as an obsolete form to be replaced remains unanswered. The story of the Grimwald family and their place among the Banished represents one of the most unusual chapters in the history of human experimentation and social control. Their systematic exclusion from human civilization created a unique situation where scientific research continued outside the boundaries of ethical oversight or legal constraint. Whether their work represented a dangerous departure from human nature or a necessary preparation for species survival may never be known with certainty. the ultimate fate of the families who pursued this path remains one of the most intriguing, unsolved mysteries of the modern era. What can be stated with confidence is that the Grimwalds and their associates among the banished pushed the boundaries of human modification further than any other documented group in history. Their willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for species adaptation, their systematic approach to genetic modification, and their ability to maintain their research despite global opposition demonstrate both the potential and the dangers of human experimentation taken to its logical extreme. The silence that has surrounded the banished since their disappearance in the 1960s may itself be significant. If they succeeded in their goals, they may have achieved modifications that make them capable of surviving in environments where normal humans cannot venture. Their absence from human civilization might indicate not failure, but success so complete that they no longer need or want contact with unmodified humanity. For those who study the history of human experimentation, the Grimwald case serves as a reminder that the boundary between scientific advancement and dangerous deviation is often determined by social consensus rather than objective criteria. The family's exclusion from human civilization was based not on criminal activity in the traditional sense, but on their pursuit of modifications that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social order. The question of whether humanity would benefit from or be threatened by the reappearance of the banished remains open. Their research may have produced innovations that could help human civilization survive future environmental challenges, or it may have created entities so divorced from human nature that they represent an existential threat to the species they claim to be trying to preserve. As climate change, genetic engineering, and other modern challenges force humanity to consider new approaches to species survival, the story of the Grimwald family and their associates becomes more than historical curiosity. It serves as a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of pursuing human modification without ethical constraints, and as a reminder that the boundaries of human nature are more fragile and more alterable than most people realize. The echoes of their work continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about genetic engineering, human enhancement, and the ethics of experimental medicine. Whether the Grimwalds were visionary pioneers or dangerous outcasts may depend ultimately on whether their predictions about the need for human adaptation prove correct, and whether their solutions prove beneficial or catastrophic for the species they sought to preserve. In the end, the family that was banned worldwide may have achieved a form of immortality through their exclusion. By placing themselves outside the normal boundaries of human civilization, they freed themselves from the constraints that limited other researchers, but also cut themselves off from the community that might have guided their work in more beneficial directions. Their story stands as a testament to human ingenuity and human hubris in equal measure, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and the drive for species survival can lead to innovations that transcend normal ethical boundaries, with consequences that may not become apparent until it is too late to change course. The mountains of Appalachia, where this story began, remain silent about what secrets they may still hide. But sometimes, on nights when the wind carries unusual sounds through the valleys and hollows, local residents remember the tale of the family that challenged the very definition of what it means to be human, and wonder whether the silence itself might be a form of waiting